They say the moon goddess makes no mistakes, that the mate bond is an eternal knot that cannot be untied. They say it is a blessing of pure devotion. They are right, but they don't tell you that when the knot is cut, the backlash feels like your soul is bleeding out. Aria felt it the instant she opened the clinic door and saw Tristan pressing Isla Moreau against the supply cabinet, his hands gripping silk that wasn't hers, his mouth devouring lips that had sneered at Aria only yesterday. Within hours, she would collapse on the sawdust floor of a borderland tavern, vision blurring, begging a hooded warlord for a spark of magic to keep her heart beating. Within days, she would wake in a citadel of ice, branded with a neon blue rune that marked her as the property of the Ruthless Warlord, the king of the 7 packs. He would look at the glowing sigil pulsing on her neck with cold calculation and warn, "You have no idea the war you've just started." But that nightmare was yet to begin. Right now, in this moment, Aria could only freeze as Tristan pulled back from Isla as guilt washed over his handsome face, quickly hardened by resolve. "Is she coming back soon?" Isla murmured, her voice dripping with false concern. Aria knew that voice, the wealthy heiress who mocked Aria's healing herbs as peasant weeds. The alpha's favorite, rich and vicious, and everything Aria wasn't. "It doesn't matter." Tristan's response was dismissive, final. "I can't pretend anymore. A healer isn't enough for an alpha heir. I need a queen." Not enough. The words didn't just hurt. They triggered the fracture. Aria felt it. The tether in her soul snapping, not like a string, but like a vein being severed. Her inner wolf screamed, a sound of such agonizing loss that Aria had to bite her own lip to keep from collapsing right there in the doorway. Years of mixing tonics for his pack, of mending their wounds, of believing her devotion would balance out her lack of status. Years of ignoring the sneers about her muddy hem, of pretending she didn't see how the elders looked at her like she was a placeholder, a servant in her own mate's house. She should have known. Should have seen it coming when he stopped visiting the clinic. When he flinched away from her healing touch, when the bond went from a warm hum to a cold, jagged silence, dying by degrees. "She'll survive," Tristan said, and Aria watched him brush a stray hair from Isla's face with a tenderness he hadn't shown her in seasons. "Once I explained that the pack comes first, that some fated matches are just incompatible." Aria must have made a sound then, a gasp, a sob, something, because Tristan's head snapped toward the open door. For a moment, their eyes locked. She saw the color drain from his face. Saw his mouth open to stammer her name. Saw something that might have been panic or pity flash in his eyes. Aria didn't wait to hear his excuse. She turned and ran. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside her as she sprinted into the rain. Mud slicked her boots, rain plastered her hair to her face, masking her tears. Behind her, she heard Tristan roaring her name, heard him scrambling over the clinic porch. But she was faster, had always been faster, and she knew the hidden paths of the borderlands better than anyone. The bond in her chest wasn't just breaking, it was killing her. The soul fracture had begun. She looked down at her hands. Black lines were creeping up her wrists, her life force bleeding out into the ether. It felt like her chest was hollowed out, her heart stuttering against ribs that felt too fragile to hold it. Her wolf was fading, confused, and hurt, and terrified all at once. By the time Aria reached the edge of the neutral zone, her lungs were burning and her vision was swimming with dark spots. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the black veins pulse, feeling her life slip away with every erratic heartbeat. Rejection was a death sentence for a healer with a sensitive soul. Everyone knew a soul fracture was fatal if not anchored immediately. And when the bond snapped, truly snapped, it took your will to live with it. Some wolves wasted away in silence. Some went mad. Aria couldn't stay here. Couldn't go back to the pack that viewed her as a discard. Couldn't face Tristan's pity or Isla's triumph. She needed to overwrite the bond. She needed powerful magic, or she would be dead by sunrise. There was only one place to find that kind of power. The thought made her tremble. Made her wolf whimper in warning. But what choice did she have? "Before we go deeper into the darkness, can you do me a favor?" Tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because what's about to unfold will leave you breathless." Aria wiped the rain from her eyes, steadied her shaking hands, and forced her legs to move. The Crow's Nest Tavern sat on the edge of the neutral lands, 3 hours from safety, a dark haven for rogues and mercenaries where names were never asked. It was the last place a healer belonged, but the only place she might find a monster strong enough to save her. The rain didn't wash away the image of them tangled together, it only seemed to freeze it against the back of Aria's eyelids. Every step she took away from the clinic was a battle against a body that was rapidly failing her. The soul fracture wasn't a metaphor, it was a physiological collapse, a violent rejection of her own life force triggered by the severance of the mate bond. It started in her fingertips, a numbness that quickly turned into a burning ache, as if her veins were being filled with liquid nitrogen. She stumbled, her knees hitting the mud with a wet thud, but she forced herself up. She couldn't stop. To stop was to die. She glanced down at her wrists in the flash of lightning and choked back a scream. The delicate blue veins were turning a sickly, rot-like black, tendrils of necrosis creeping up her forearms toward her heart. She was a healer. She knew exactly what this was. Her soul was unraveling, searching for the anchor that had just cut her loose, and finding only the void. Without a new tether, her heart would simply stop beating before dawn. The forest blurred into a kaleidoscope of gray shadows and driving rain. Aria didn't know how long she ran, only that the pain in her chest had transformed from a dull ache to a jagged agony, like shattered glass grinding against her ribs with every breath. She needed power. She needed an anchor so heavy, so immutable, that it could shock her dying spirit back into submission. The Crow's Nest emerged from the gloom like a rotting tooth on the edge of the territory line. It was a structure of warped wood and iron, leaking light and the heavy bass of rowdy conversation. It was a place for the packless, the rogues, the mercenaries who sold their claws to the highest bidder. A week ago, Aria wouldn't have dared walk past its entrance. Tonight, it was her only hope. She pushed open the heavy oak door, and the noise inside died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of wet fur, cheap ale, and aggression. Aria stood swaying in the doorway, a drowned rat in a den of wolves. She could feel the eyes on her, calculating, predatory, dismissive. She smelled of rain and rapidly decaying magic. To them, she wasn't a guest, she was a corpse walking. "Lost, little healer," a voice sneered from the bar, followed by a ripple of dark laughter. Aria ignored them. She didn't have the breath to respond. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the room going gray. She scanned the shadows, her healer's instincts hunting for something specific. She didn't need a kind wolf. She didn't need a good wolf. She needed a monster. She needed someone whose soul was so dense, so overpowering, that it could withstand the vacuum of her own fracturing spirit. Then, she felt it. It wasn't a scent, but a gravitational pull. In the far corner, shrouded in the deepest shadows, sat a figure that seemed to absorb the light around him. He wasn't participating in the drinking or the gambling. He was simply existing, a stillness in the chaos that screamed of violence held on a tight leash. Even from across the room, Aria could feel the static charge of his aura. It tasted like ozone and ancient iron. He wore a heavy cloak lined with dark fur, his face obscured, but the power radiating off him was undeniable. It was the power of an alpha, but darker, heavier. He was the storm she needed to weather her own. Aria took a step, her legs trembling violently. The black lines on her arms had reached her elbows now, concealed beneath her soaked sleeves, but she could feel the cold fingers of death brushing her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to run away from the man in the corner, to flee the predator that even the other rogues seemed to give a wide berth. But desperation was a louder voice than fear. Before Aria makes the most dangerous decision of her life, I have a question for you. If you were in her shoes, dying from a broken heart, would you trust a stranger to save you, or would you face the end alone? Let me know in the comments right now. She forced her body to move, crossing the tavern floor. The silence stretched, the other patrons watching with morbid curiosity as the broken female approached the most dangerous table in the room. The stranger didn't look up as she neared. He sat with a tankard untouched before him, his hand resting on the table, large, scarred, and lethal. Aria reached the table and gripped the edge to keep from collapsing, her knuckles white. "Help me," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper over the drumming of the rain on the roof. The man slowly lifted his head. The hood fell back slightly, revealing a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that burned with a terrifying, unnatural intensity. They weren't just green. They were the color of deep forests where no light touched. He looked at her, and Aria felt stripped bare, as if he could see the rotting bond in her chest, the black veins, the pathetic desperation of a discarded mate. He didn't speak. He just watched, his expression impassive, bored even. "Please," Aria choked out, her legs finally giving way. She sank to her knees on the dirty floorboards beside his chair, her hand grasping at his cloak. The contact sent a shockwave through her, a jolt of pure energy that made her gasp. It was painful, but it was alive. "I am fracturing. I need an anchor." The stranger looked down at her, his lip curling slightly. "And you think I have mercy to sell, little wolf?" "I don't want mercy," Aria whispered, her head spinning as darkness began to consume her vision completely. She looked up at him, tears mixing with the rain on her face, offering him the only thing she had left. "I want to live. Mark me. Overwrite it. Own it. Just don't let me fade." The stranger didn't blink. He looked at the hand clutching his cloak, pale, trembling, with the necrotic black lines of the soul fracture now visible creeping past her wrist bone, and then back up to her face. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cold, terrifying calculation. He was assessing her not as a person, but as a broken instrument, weighing the cost of repair against the potential use. "You ask for a mark," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards beneath her knees. It was the sound of shifting tectonic plates, deep and dangerous. "But you are blind to what stands before you. I am not some wandering rogue looking for a bed warmer. I do not offer safety, little wolf. I offer ownership." Aria's breath hitched, a ragged sound that tore at her burning throat. "I don't care," she managed, the edges of her vision darkening into a tunnel of gray static. "Anything is better than this." "Is it?" He leaned forward, the shadows seemingly clinging to him, refusing to let the tavern's dim lantern light touch his face. "My help comes with a price that cannot be paid in coin. If I anchor you, if I pour my power into that shattering void in your chest, you do not just survive. You belong to the dark. You belong to me." Aria felt her heart stutter, a beat missed, then two. The fracture was reaching its terminal stage. She could feel the cold emptiness expanding, eating away the memories of warmth, of laughter, leaving only the hollow ache of Tristan's betrayal. The fear of this stranger, this predator who smelled of blood and iron, paled in comparison to the absolute terror of ceasing to exist. "Take it," she whispered, her voice failing. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against the rough leather of his boot. "Take everything." The stranger let out a sigh, a sound of irritation mixed with resolve. "So be it." He moved then, faster than any wolf she had ever seen. One moment he was seated, the next he was crouching before her, his large hand enveloping her throat. Aria flinched, instinctively bracing for the searing pain of teeth sinking into flesh, the primal, bloody tearing that marked a traditional mating or claiming. She waited for the bite that would sever the dying bond and graft a new one in its place. But the bite never came. Instead, his grip tightened, his thumb pressing hard against the pulse point where her life was frantically trying to escape. His skin was impossibly hot, a stark contrast to the deathly cold spreading through her limbs. "Look at me," he commanded. Aria forced her heavy eyelids open. Up close, his eyes were a kaleidoscope of emerald and abyss, swirling with a power that wasn't just biological. It was arcane. "This is going to hurt," he murmured, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. He didn't break her skin. He broke the air around them. A sudden, high-pitched hum filled the tavern, causing the glass tankards on the nearby tables to rattle. The stranger unleashed the leash he held on his aura, and the pressure in the room dropped instantly. Aria gasped as a surge of raw, unfiltered magic flooded from his palm directly into her jugular. It wasn't the warm, golden light of a fated mate bond. It was a torrent of blue fire. Aria screamed, her back arching, but his hand held her pinned in place, an immovable object against her thrashing force. The magic tore through her veins, hunting down the necrotic black rot of the soul fracture. Where the old bond had been a soft tether, this new power was a relentless glacier, freezing the decay, cauterizing the emotional wounds with ruthless efficiency. The patrons in the tavern scrambled back, chairs crashing over, as the dark corner of the room was illuminated by a blinding, neon azure light. On Aria's neck, beneath his palm, the skin knit and reformed. The flesh didn't just heal, it changed. A complex, angular rune began to sear itself into her skin, glowing with an internal luminescence that shone through his fingers. It felt like being branded with ice, a cold so intense it burned. The symbol etched itself deep, weaving into her muscle, her blood, her very DNA. Anchor, the stranger growled, his voice echoing with a dual resonance, human and beast. Bind. Live. The climax of the agony hit her all at once, a supernova of sensation that blinded her. And then, just as suddenly, it vanished. Aria collapsed against him, gasping for air that suddenly tasted sweet again. The crushing weight on her chest was gone. The black lines on her arms receded rapidly, chasing back down her veins until they disappeared entirely, leaving her skin flush with new, frantic color. She lay there, trembling, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his cloak. The silence in the tavern was absolute now. No one breathed. No one moved. Slowly, Aria raised a shaking hand to her neck. She expected to feel the jagged puncture wounds of a bite. Instead, her fingers traced the raised, smooth ridges of a scar that felt fever-hot to the touch. She looked down at her chest. A soft, rhythmic blue light pulsed from beneath the collar of her tunic, syncing with a heartbeat that was strong, steady, and terrifyingly slow. It wasn't just a mark. It was a brand. A low, vibrating hum settled into her bones, an icy, protective frequency that wrapped around her mind like a shield wall. It whispered of snow-capped mountains and steel fortresses. It felt safe, but it also felt heavy. "Can you stand?" the stranger asked, his voice returning to its cool, detached baritone. He pulled his hand away, and Aria saw the faint remnants of blue energy dissipating from his fingertips. I think so," Aria stammered. She felt lightheaded, but not from death. She felt supercharged, like she had just swallowed a lightning bolt. She scrambled to her feet, swaying slightly. The stranger stood with her, towering over her frame. He reached out and adjusted her collar, pulling the fabric up to hide the glowing neon sigil that now marred her skin. "Good," he said, turning his back on the stunned tavern patrons and tossing a heavy gold coin onto the table. "Because we are leaving." Aria blinked, the adrenaline crash beginning to set in. "Leaving? Where?" The stranger paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. The shadows seemed to wrap around him again, welcoming him back. "You asked to be saved, little wolf. You asked me to own the debt." He turned fully, and for the first time, Aria saw the symbol on the clasp of his cloak, a silver wolf's head wreathed in 7 iron spikes. "Now," he said, opening the door to the storm, "we go home." Consciousness returned to Aria not with the gentle warmth of sunlight, but with the rhythmic, jarring vibration of wooden wheels rolling over hard-packed earth. The smell of stale ale and rain was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive leather, pine, and that same ozone and iron aroma that had permeated the tavern. She blinked her eyes open, expecting the rotting ceiling beams of the crow's nest. Instead, she found herself swathed in heavy furs, resting against plush velvet cushions in the dim interior of a carriage. She sat up, clutching the furs to her chest. The memory of the neon blue fire and the searing pain on her neck came rushing back. Her hand flew to the spot. The skin was smooth, but beneath her fingertips, she could feel the faint, steady thrum of magic. It was real. She pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain of the window. Outside, the world was a blur of gray mist and pine trees, but what made her breath hitch wasn't the landscape. It was the escort. Flanking the carriage on all sides were wolves, massive, armored beasts trotting in perfect unison. They wore plating of dark steel, etched with runes that shimmered in the gloom. This wasn't a mercenary band. This was a legion. You slept for 12 hours. A deep voice rumbled from the shadows across from her. Aria spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stranger sat there, his hood down now. In the daylight filtering through the curtains, he was even more terrifying. His hair was black as a raven's wing, swept back from a face that was severe and striking, marked by a thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He was reading a parchment, looking every inch a king, not a rogue. "Where are we?" Aria asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" He lowered the parchment, fixing her with those unsettling green abyss eyes. "We are crossing the border into the Northern Territories. As for who I am..." He gestured vaguely to the silver clasp on his cloak, the same wolf's head wreathed in 7 spikes she had glimpsed before passing out. "I thought a healer would recognize the sigil of the Varco's bloodline." Aria froze. The air left her lungs in a rush. Varco's. The name was a curse in the southern lands, a bedtime story told to frighten pups. Lucien Varco's. The Ruthless Warlord. The Alpha who had conquered the 7 fractured packs and forged them into an empire of iron and ice. He wasn't a savior, he was a tyrant. Hold on, it gets better. Before we see Aria's reaction to realizing she just bonded herself to the most ruthless king in the world, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. You do not want to miss the twist coming up in Chapter 7. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She had traded a cheating mate for a monster. She had bound her soul to a man known for executing dissenters and ruling with a fist of steel. "Stop the carriage," Aria whispered, backing away until her spine hit the door. Lucien didn't move. He didn't even look alarmed. He simply watched her with that maddeningly calm expression. "I cannot do that." "I said stop." Aria yelled, desperation clawing at her throat. She fumbled for the latch, her fingers slipping on the polished brass. "I didn't agree to this. I didn't know who you were. Let me out." "Aria, do not." She threw the door open. The cold wind whipped into the cabin, biting and harsh. The ground was rushing by at a dangerous speed, but Aria didn't care. She would take her chances with a fall rather than be a prisoner of the Wolf King. She braced herself to jump. Agony exploded in her chest. It wasn't the dull ache of the soul fracture. This was a sharp, violent yank, as if a hook had been embedded in her heart and someone had just pulled the line taut. The blue mark on her neck flared hot, searing her skin with a blinding flash of neon light. Aria cried out, her body seizing up. Her muscles locked, disobeying her command to jump, forcing her to curl inward. She collapsed onto the floor of the carriage, gasping for air, clutching her chest. It felt like she was being dragged back, physically and spiritually, toward the man sitting across from her. "I warned you," Lucien said, his voice devoid of sympathy but heavy with authority. He leaned down and effortlessly hauled her back onto the seat, kicking the door shut with his boot. "The mark is an anchor, Aria. It tethers your fractured life force to mine." Aria lay trembling on the cushions, tears streaming down her face as the pain slowly receded into a dull, throbbing pulse. The blue light on her neck dimmed, but the hum was louder now, an insistent vibration against her jugular. "You tried to sever the connection by leaving my radius," Lucien explained, watching her with a clinical detachment. "Your soul cannot survive on its own yet. It needs the proximity of the source. If you run from me, the bond will not break. It will simply drag you back until your heart gives out from the strain." Aria stared up at him, horror dawning on her. She wasn't just saved. She was leashed. So I'm a prisoner, she whispered, her voice cracking. No, Lucian replied, turning his gaze back to the window, watching his army march through the snow. You are alive. And for now, that will have to be enough. The carriage wheels transitioned from the muffled crunch of snow to the harsh, rhythmic clatter of cobblestones, signaling the end of their journey. Aria huddled deeper into the furs Lucian had thrown at her, though the cold seeping into the cabin wasn't just atmospheric, it was the chill of the landscape itself. When the vehicle finally lurched to a halt, the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant, mournful howl of wind tearing through stone passes. Lucian didn't wait for a footman. He kicked the door open, letting in a blast of freezing air that smelled of pine resin and steel. He stepped out first, his boots crunching on the ice, and then turned, offering a gloved hand. It wasn't a gesture of chivalry, it was a command. Aria took it, her fingers trembling, and stepped down onto the frozen earth of the north. She looked up and gasped. The citadel didn't just sit on the mountain, it was carved from it. Black stone rose in jagged spires that pierced the gray sky, merging with the ice of the glacier behind it. It was a fortress built for war, not comfort, a monstrous silhouette that seemed to swallow the meager light of the afternoon sun. Banners bearing the silver wolf and 7 spikes snapped violently in the gale, the sound like cracking whips. "Welcome to Iron Peak," Lucian said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, his gaze was fixed on the massive iron gates grinding open ahead of them. A squad of guards stood at attention, their armor frosted over, but one figure separated from the formation and marched toward them. He was nearly as tall as Lucian, with hair the color of dirty straw and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and then dropped. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent, cynical sneer. This was Darius Kane, the beater of the 7 packs, and the look he gave Aria was not one of welcome. It was the look a wolf gave a trap before snapping its jaws shut. "You're late," Darius grunted, ignoring the king to glare at Aria. He didn't bow. "And you've brought a stray." "Careful, Darius," Lucian warned, the temperature around him dropping a few degrees. He walked past his beater, forcing Aria to scramble to keep up with his long strides or risk the pain of the tether stretching too tight. Darius fell in step beside them, his heavy boots thudding ominously. "I'm being careful. You disappeared for 3 days into the neutral zone and came back with a southern female who smells like heartbreak and—" He paused, his nose wrinkling as he inhaled sharply. He stopped dead in the courtyard, his hand dropping to the hilt of the blade at his hip. "Lucian, what have you done?" Lucian stopped, turning slowly to face his second-in-command. The tension in the courtyard was sudden and suffocating. The other guards averted their eyes, sensing the alpha dominance rolling off their king in waves. "She was dying," Lucian said simply. "So you let her die," Darius snapped, his voice rising. "You don't bind her to the Varco's line. Do you have any idea what the council will do? A commoner? A broken mate from a minor pack? They'll say you're compromised. They'll say she's a spy sent by the Southern Coalition to bleed your power dry." Aria shrank back, the accusation stinging like a slap. She wanted to shout that she hadn't asked for this, that she would have preferred death over being a political pawn, but her voice was frozen in her throat. Darius looked at her with pure disgust, as if she were a parasite attached to his king. "She is not a spy," Lucian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl. "She is an investment, and she is under my protection. If you question my judgment again in front of the guard, Darius, I will remind you why I hold the crown and you do not." The threat hung in the icy air. Darius clenched his jaw, the muscles feathering, but he stepped back. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Aria, cold and calculating. "If she betrays us," he whispered, low enough that only they could hear, "I will kill her myself, mark or no mark." "Noted," Lucian replied dismissively. He grabbed Aria's upper arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and steered her away from the beater and into the dark maw of the keep. The interior of the citadel was a labyrinth of black stone and flickering torches. It was warmer than the outside, but only just. Aria was marched through endless corridors, past tapestries depicting bloody battles and wolves tearing stags apart, until Lucien stopped before a heavy wooden door. "These are your quarters," he said, pushing the door open. "Stay inside. The court is curious, and I do not have the patience to explain you to them tonight." "Wait," Aria said, finding her voice as he turned to leave. "What am I to you? A prisoner? A guest?" Lucien paused, his hand on the iron latch. He looked back at her, his green eyes unreadable in the shadows. "You are the only thing keeping your own heart beating, Aria. Figure out what that means before dawn." The door slammed shut, the heavy bolts sliding home from the outside. Aria stood in the center of the room. It was vast and stark, furnished with heavy dark wooden furs that probably cost more than her father's entire estate. A fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows against the stone walls. But her eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a tall, gilded mirror stood. She hadn't seen herself since the clinic. Since the rain. Since the tavern. Slowly, terrifyingly, she walked toward the glass. The woman staring back looked like a ghost. Her skin was pale, her hair a tangled mess of windblown waves, her eyes wide and haunted. But it wasn't her face that held her attention. Her tunic had slipped off one shoulder during the rough handling in the courtyard. There, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic luminescence, was the mark. It wasn't a tattoo. It wasn't a scar. It was a living construct of neon blue light, etched into her flesh like a circuit board of ancient magic. It started at the base of her neck and sprawled outward across her collarbone and up toward her ear, intricate and terrifyingly beautiful. The geometric lines formed the stylized head of a wolf, wreathed in 7 sharp spikes, the sigil of the Varco's empire. Aria reached up, her trembling fingers hovering over the brand. She expected heat, but the light was cold, humming against her fingertips with a low, vibrating power that synced perfectly with her own pulse. It was beautiful, alien, and permanent. She traced the lines of the glowing crest, watching the blue light flare in response to her touch. Tristan had marked her heart with betrayal, leaving invisible scars that would never fully heal. But Lucien Varco's had branded her soul with neon fire, turning her into a beacon in the dark. She looked at her reflection, at the frightened healer wearing the collar of a warlord, and for the first time, she didn't see a victim. She saw something dangerous. She saw a warning sign. The great hall of Iron Peak was a cavernous moor of black stone and flickering torchlight, vast enough to hold an army and cold enough to preserve a corpse. Tonight, however, the chill was kept at bay not by the roaring hearths, but by the sheer, suffocating heat of so many alpha auras crammed into one space. Aria stood in the shadows of the dais, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the velvet of the midnight blue gown Lucien had ordered for her. It was heavy, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like frost, but it was the collar that drew the eye. It dipped just low enough to reveal the base of her throat and the neon blue Varco sigil that pulsed with a steady, rhythmic warning. "Breathe." Lucien's voice was a low rumble against her ear. He stood beside her, not touching her, yet his presence was a physical weight, a shield wall between her and the room below. He wore his crown tonight, a simple, brutal circlet of dark iron that looked more like a weapon than jewelry. "They smell your fear. Do not give them the satisfaction of tasting it." "There are so many," Aria whispered, her eyes scanning the floor. The leaders of the 7 packs had gathered. To the left stood the river lords in their silks and scales, to the right, the mountain alphas wrapped in bare furs. It was a volatile mix of alliances held together only by the terrifying strength of the man standing next to her. And they were all looking at her. The whispers had started the moment she entered, the stray with the king's mark. "They are wolves," Lucien said, his green eyes scanning the crowd with bored lethality. "They respect only teeth. Show them yours." Before Aria could ask how a healer was supposed to show teeth, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall groaned open. The chatter in the room died instantly. Presenting the delegation of the Southern Sun Pack, the herald bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Alpha heir Tristan Cole and his companion, Lady Isla Moreau. Aria's breath hitched, the sound loud in the sudden silence. The mark on her neck flared hot, a defensive surge of magic that made her gasp. Tristan strode in, looking every inch the golden prince he believed himself to be. He wore cream and gold, the colors of the wealthy South, his blonde hair perfectly coiffed, his smile practiced and charming. On his arm, Isla preened, draped in expensive fox furs that looked garish against the stark brutality of the North. She looked triumphant, the picture of a future queen, exactly what Tristan had said he needed. Aria felt a phantom ache in her chest, the ghost of the fracture, but before it could take root, the blue rune on her skin hummed louder, drowning out the pain with icy reassurance. Lucien took a step forward, drawing the room's attention. "Welcome, Heir Cole," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous, like velvet wrapped around a dagger. "You are far from your sunny orchards." Tristan bowed, a graceful, courtly motion that seemed ridiculous here. "King Lucien, we come to reaffirm our loyalty to the crown and to celebrate the unification." He straightened, his eyes sweeping the dais, looking for the king's beater or perhaps a council member. Then, his gaze landed on Aria. He froze. The polite smile slid off his face like melting wax. He blinked, once, twice, as if trying to reconcile the image before him with the reality he knew. He had left her broken and dying in the rain less than a week ago. He had discarded her as a common healer, unfit for his ascension. Now, she stood on the dais of the High King, draped in royal velvet, looking down at him. "Aria?" The name slipped out, a breathless question that carried to the front rows of the assembly. Isla stiffened beside him, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the woman she had sneered at. "What is she doing here?" Isla hissed, though her voice lacked its usual venom, replaced by a creeping confusion. "She's supposed to be dead." Lucien finished the sentence for her. He moved then, stepping closer to Aria, his body language shifting from regal to possessive. He didn't touch her, but he didn't have to. The air around them warped with the pressure of his dominance. Tristan took an involuntary step forward, his shock morphing into something uglier. Indignation. "Aria, come down from there," he commanded, his voice pitching up. "This is a summit for pack leaders. You are a healer. You have no business." He stopped. His eyes had drifted lower, to the neckline of her dress. The neon blue wolf's head wreathed in 7 spikes pulsed violently, casting an eerie glow on Aria's pale skin. It wasn't a tattoo. It was a brand of raw magic, living and breathing. Tristan's face went the color of ash. He knew that sigil. Every wolf from the cradle to the grave knew the mark of the warlord. It didn't just mean she was claimed. It meant she was bound by blood and magic to the most powerful bloodline in existence. Aria saw the realization crash into him. She saw the moment the math in his head shifted. He had rejected her because she lacked status, because she couldn't offer him a political advantage. He had thrown her away to climb the ladder with Isla. And now, he was looking at a woman who outranked him in every conceivable way. He had severed a bond with a commoner only to find out she was destined to be the anchor of a king. "You?" Tristan choked out, his eyes darting between Lucien and Aria. Horror dawned in his gaze, not for her safety, but for his own mistake. He had thrown away the key to the kingdom. "You mocked her." "She asked for a savior," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that silenced the entire hall. "You offered her a grave. I offered her a throne." Tristan looked sick. The jealousy that flared in his scent was acrid, burning the noses of everyone nearby. It wasn't love. It was the bitter, greedy realization of a man who had sold a diamond for a handful of glass. He looked at Isla, who was shrinking away from the dais, terrified of the glowing mark, and then back to Aria, his expression crumbling. "Aria, Tristan started, taking another step, his hand reaching out as if the old bond might still be there to grab onto. The mark on Aria's neck flashed blindingly bright. A low, warning growl ripped through the hall, but it didn't come from Lucien. It came from the rune itself, a magical reverberation of the king's rage channeled through her skin. "Do not speak to her," Lucian commanded. He stepped in front of Aria, blocking Tristan's view, his shadow consuming the golden prince. "You severed your tie, pup. She is Varco's now. And if you take one more step toward my mate, the southern pack will be looking for a new heir by sunrise." Tristan recoiled as if struck, stumbling back into Isla. The surrounding alphas watched with wide eyes, the shift in power palpable. The stray healer was gone. In her place stood a woman protected by the monster in the dark, and the man who had broken her could only watch from the floor, realizing far too late that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. The tension in the great hall didn't dissipate after the confrontation on the dais. It merely curdled into a thick, suffocating atmosphere of whispered judgments. Lucian had been pulled away by the river lords for a strategic discussion regarding border treaties, leaving Aria momentarily exposed at the high table. She sat stiffly, the velvet of her gown heavy against her skin, acutely aware that she was a gazelle sitting in a den of lions. It didn't take long for the first predator to circle. Isla Moreau approached the dais not with the deference due to the king's companion, but with the slinking confidence of a viper in tall grass. She held 2 goblets of wine, her smile tight and trembling at the corners. The humiliation of Tristan's earlier rejection still clung to her scent, sour and sharp, but she had masked it with layers of expensive perfume. "A peace offering," Isla said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness as she extended one of the jeweled goblets toward Aria. "We got off on the wrong foot, didn't we? I thought we should toast to new beginnings, to your sudden elevation." The hall went quiet nearby. The southern delegation watched with bated breath. It was a social trap. Refuse the drink, and Aria looked arrogant and ungracious. Accept it, and she submitted to Isla's gesture. Aria reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the cup. As she brought it closer, the aroma of spiced wine hit her nose, cinnamon, clove, blood orange, and something else. A faint, metallic tang hidden beneath the heavy spices. Silverbane. It was a mild toxin to a shifter, not enough to kill, but enough to induce violent nausea, tremors, and an inability to control one's shift. Isla wasn't trying to murder her. She was trying to make Aria vomit on the king's table in front of 7 alpha leaders. She wanted to prove the stray didn't belong. Aria stopped the goblet inches from her lips. She looked at Isla, whose eyes were gleaming with anticipation. "You forget," Aria whispered, her voice low enough that only the nearby wolves could hear, "that before I was a stray, I was the best healer in the southern pack." Isla's smile faltered. "Silverbane has a distinct aftertaste of copper," Aria continued, her gaze hardening. "And it reacts poorly with gold chalices." She tilted the goblet, pouring the dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. Where the wine pooled, the fabric hissed and smoked slightly, the toxin reacting to the air. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. "If you wish to poison the king's mate," Aria said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline crashing through her veins, "you'll have to do better than a common emetic." Isla turned pale, snatching her hand back as if burned. Before she could stammer a denial, the heavy doors of the hall banged open, creating a distraction that Isla used to scurry back into the crowd like a frightened rat. Aria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She needed air. The stench of treachery and roasted meat was making her head spin. She slipped out through a side archway, finding herself in a quiet, torchlit corridor that smelled of stone and ice. She leaned against the wall, pressing her hands to her burning cheeks. The mark on her neck hummed a low, agitated rhythm, sensing her distress, but she pushed the magic down. She just needed a moment of silence. "You've changed." The voice came from the shadows, familiar and achingly soft. Aria stiffened, turning to find Tristan standing at the end of the hall. He looked wrecked, his golden hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look like the arrogant heir who had discarded her. He looked like the boy she had fallen in love with years ago. "Tristan," she said, her voice guarded. "Go back to the feast." "I can't," he said, taking a step toward her. "I can't watch you sitting up there next to him." Aria, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know who he is? He is the man who saved me when you left me to die. Aria shot back, the anger finally breaking through her exhaustion. I made a mistake. Tristan pleaded, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hands hovering near her shoulders, afraid to touch but desperate to connect. I was scared, Aria. My father, the pressure of the succession. I thought I needed an alliance. But when I saw you tonight, when I saw him parading you around like a trophy. He lowered his voice, glancing nervously down the hall. Lucien Varcos is a monster. They call him the Soul Eater. He doesn't bond with mates, Aria. He consumes them. He's using you as a battery. That mark isn't protection, it's a straw. He's going to drain you dry until there's nothing left, and then he'll toss you aside just like. He stopped, swallowing hard. Just like you did. Aria finished quietly. I would never hurt you like that, Tristan insisted, his eyes wide and earnest. I love you. The bond, it's still there. I can feel it, faint and buried, but it's there. We can fix this. Come back to the south with me. We'll run tonight. I'll protect you from him. Can you believe the audacity of Tristan? Trying to win her back after what he did. If you think Aria should reject him, drop a queen emoji in the comments. If you think she should hear him out, well, let me know why. Aria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the desperation, yes, but beneath it, she saw the same weakness that had led him to Isla. He wasn't afraid for her safety, he was afraid of losing a possession he had realized was valuable too late. He spoke of protection, but he was standing in the shadows, whispering lies, while Lucien had stood in the light and threatened a room full of alphas for her. You say you love me, Aria said softly. I do, Tristan breathed, stepping closer, emboldened. More than anything. Then why? She asked, her eyes drifting to the gold insignia on his chest. Did it take a king claiming me for you to realize I was worth keeping? Tristan flinched, his mouth opening and closing. The bond you feel isn't love, Tristan, Aria said, stepping back, putting space between them. It's regret. And I don't want it. You don't know what you're saying, Tristan snapped, his gentle mask slipping to reveal a flash of anger. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight. You belong to me, Aria. Fated bonds are eternal. You can't just overwrite nature with some dark magic trick. As his skin touched hers, the neon mark on Aria's neck didn't just hum, it roared. A shockwave of blue energy blasted outward from her skin, hot and violent. Tristan yelled, releasing her as if he'd grabbed a live wire, cradling his scorched hand against his chest. I didn't do that, Aria gasped, staring at the rune which was now blazing with a ferocious light. No, a deep voice rumbled from the darkness behind Tristan. I did. Tristan spun around, terror flooding his scent. Lucien emerged from the shadows, the air around him crackling with black lightning. He didn't look at Tristan, his eyes were fixed on Aria, assessing her for damage. I told you, Lucien said, his voice a calm, terrifying promise of violence, that if you touched her again, the southern pack would need a new heir. He took a step forward, and the stone floor beneath his boot cracked. I am a man of my word. The air in the stone corridor didn't just smell of ozone and burnt skin. It smelled of imminent death. Lucien stood over Tristan like an executioner waiting for the signal to drop the axe, the shadows around him writhing as if they were alive. His aura was so heavy it made the torches flicker and dim, casting the hallway into a strobe-light nightmare. You have 3 seconds to run, Lucien said, his voice a low, vibrating purr that terrified Aria more than a scream would have. 1. Tristan scrambled backward, clutching his scorched wrist to his chest. He looked from the lethal promise in the king's eyes to the open archway leading back to the great hall. He realized with dawning horror that he couldn't win a physical fight. He wouldn't even survive the first strike. But Tristan Cole was a politician's son, and when cornered, a politician didn't use claws. He used words. I invoke the lex vincula. Tristan screamed, his voice cracking but loud enough to carry into the feast hall. I invoke the right of stolen bonds. Lucien paused, his lip curling in disgust, but he didn't strike. The silence that followed was deafening. Inside the great hall, the music stopped. The chatter died. A moment later, the heavy doors were pushed open, and Darius Kane stepped out, followed by the curious and bloodthirsty gazes of the 7-pack leaders. He invoked the right, Darius said, his face grim as he looked at his king. You cannot kill him now, Lucien. Not without starting a civil war. Tristan, sensing his momentary safety, scrambled to his feet and backed toward the audience of alphas. He straightened his disheveled tunic, finding his courage in the presence of witnesses. This man, he pointed a shaking finger at Lucien, has violated the most sacred laws of our kind. He did not win a mate. He scavenged one. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. The accusation was grave. To steal a mate, especially one in a vulnerable state, was a crime that stripped an alpha of his honor. Aria was suffering from a soul fracture, Tristan announced, his voice gaining strength as he played to the crowd. She was delirious. Dying. She was in no state to consent to a blood binding. King Lucien took advantage of a mental break to sever a fated bond and enslave a female of my pack. By the ancient laws, I demand her return. I demand the bond be annulled. Lucien didn't speak. He simply walked into the great hall, the crowd parting for him like water before a shark. He stopped at the foot of the dais, turning slowly to face the accuser. The rage radiating off him was palpable, a heat that made the air shimmer. You discarded her, Lucien said, his voice deadly quiet. You left her to rot in the rain while you paraded your mistress through my court. And now you speak of laws. I made a mistake. Tristan shouted, sweating now under the pressure of the king's glare. A mistake between mates is a private matter. It does not give a foreign warlord the right to poach her like cattle. She is mine by right of fate. She was stolen in a moment of weakness. She is mine by right of blood, Lucien snarled, his control snapping. The shadows erupted from his skin, tendrils of darkness lashing out. And I will tear the tongue from your head before I let you touch her again. Lucien lunged. The movement was a blur, a streak of violence that no eye could track. Darius shouted a warning, but it was too late. Lucien's hand closed around Tristan's throat, lifting the alpha heir off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Tristan gagged, his feet kicking helplessly, his eyes bulging as the king squeezed the life out of him in front of the entire summit. Lucien, stop. The command didn't come from Darius. It came from the doorway. Aria stepped into the light. Her velvet gown swished against the stone floor, the sound distinct in the terrified silence. She walked past the gaping alphas, past Isla who was cowering behind a pillar, and straight toward the monster who was seconds away from crushing her ex-mate's windpipe. Put him down, Aria said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. Lucien looked at her, his eyes entirely black, the beast fully in control. He claimed I stole you, he growled, tightening his grip. He insulted you. He dies. If you kill him now, you prove him right, Aria said, stepping into the circle of his rage. She reached out, placing her hand over his, the hand that was killing Tristan. The moment her skin touched his, the neon mark on her neck flared, pulsing a soothing, rhythmic blue light that cut through the darkness of his aura. You prove that you are just a beast who takes what he wants. And you are more than that. Lucien's gaze flickered to the mark, then back to her face. The black receded from his eyes, leaving the familiar green abyss. With a snarl of frustration, he released his grip. Tristan dropped to the floor, gasping and retching, clutching his bruised throat. Aria didn't look at the man on the floor. She turned to face the room, the 7 alphas, the river lords, the mountain kings. They were watching her with judgment, weighing her worth. Tristan Cole claims I was stolen, Aria said, her voice ringing clear through the hall. She touched the glowing sigil on her neck, feeling the hum of Lucien's power, the anchor that had pulled her back from the void. He claims I was weak. That I was a victim of a warlord's greed. She looked down at Tristan, who was looking up at her with watery, pleading eyes. I was dying, she admitted. My soul was fracturing because the man on the floor, my fated mate, decided I wasn't enough for his ambition. I was in pain. I was broken. She turned back to Lucien, who was watching her with an intensity that made the rest of the room disappear. But I was not stolen, Aria declared. I walked into the darkness. I begged for the bargain. I offered my life to the only man strong enough to hold it together. She stepped closer to Lucien, slipping her hand into his large, scarred one. She felt his fingers tighten around hers immediately, an unbreakable lock. He did not steal me, Aria said, the finality of her words settling like iron over the assembly. I chose him. The silence that followed Aria's declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. The gathered alphas stared, stunned by the sight of a common healer standing toe-to-toe with a realm's nightmare, her hand clasped firmly in his. Tristan remained on his knees, staring at the floor, the realization of his monumental failure finally sinking in. He had gambled his soul for status, and he had lost everything. But not everyone was paralyzed by defeat. Isla Moreau stood near the pillar, watching her future disintegrate. She had spent years scheming, poisoning rivals, and whispering in Tristan's ear to secure her place as the Southern Alpha female. She had humiliated Aria, mocked her poverty, and driven her into the storm to die. And now, that same stray was standing on the dais, draped in royal velvet, holding the hand of the High King. The injustice of it, the sheer, blinding jealousy, snapped the last thread of Isla's sanity. No, she shrieked, the sound tearing through the hall like a banshee's wail. You are nothing. You are a dirt-poor tonic mixer. Isla moved before the guards could react. She didn't shift. She didn't have the patience for bones to break and reform. She pulled a slender, silver-tipped dagger from the folds of her furs, a weapon meant for court treachery, and lunged. She wasn't aiming for Lucien. She knew she couldn't touch him. She was aiming for the throat of the woman who had stolen her crown. Die, you mongrel! Isla screamed, closing the distance in a blur of silk and steel. Tristan shouted a warning, but he was too slow. Lucien began to turn, his claws lengthening, but even he was a fraction of a second behind the sheer unpredictability of Isla's madness. Aria saw the flash of silver. She saw the hate in Isla's eyes. She flinched, throwing her hands up instinctively to protect her face. But the blow never landed. The neon brand on her neck didn't just hum. It screamed. The ancient magic of the Varco's bloodline, sensing the imminent threat to its host, reacted with catastrophic violence. The blue rune flared brighter than the sun, blinding every wolf in the room. A shockwave of pure, condensed energy exploded outward from Aria's skin. It wasn't a shield, it was a detonation. The force of it hit Isla like a physical wall. The dagger shattered in her hand, disintegrating into metal dust. Isla was lifted off her feet and thrown backward, flying across the great hall to smash into the heavy banquet tables, sending goblets and platters crashing to the stone floor. The shockwave didn't stop there. It rolled through the room, knocking the front row of Alpha guards to their knees and extinguishing half the torches in the hall. The ground beneath Aria's feet cracked, a spiderweb of fissures glowing with fading blue light. Silence returned, absolute and terrified. Aria lowered her hands, blinking the spots from her vision. She looked at her palms, which were glowing faintly, then at the devastation in front of her. Isla lay groaning in a pile of broken wood and spilled wine, unable to rise. Lucien stared at Aria. For the first time, there was genuine surprise on his face. He looked at the glowing mark, then at the destruction it had caused, and a slow, dark smile spread across his lips. It wasn't the smile of a savior. It was the smile of a king who had just found his queen. He didn't step in front of her to protect her this time. He stepped beside her. Darius, Lucien said, his voice ringing with terrifying calm. Did you see that? The beater, who was picking himself up from the floor, looked at Aria with wide, pale eyes. The disdain was gone, replaced by fear and a grudging awe. I saw it, my king. That, Lucian addressed the room, sweeping his gaze over the cowering alphas, is not the magic of a stray. That is the judgment of the citadel. He reached out and took Aria's hand again, raising it high for the assembly to see. The blue light of the mark pulsed in rhythm with his own aura, two halves of a devastating whole. You questioned her worth, Lucian roared, his voice shaking the banners in the rafters. You called her common. You called her weak. But the Varco's magic does not bond to weakness. It consumes it. That she stands here, breathing, wielding my fire, is proof that she is stronger than any of you. He looked down at Aria, his green eyes blazing with pride. She is not merely my mate. She is my equal. She is the alpha queen of the 7 packs. Aria looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had sneered at her only hours ago. Now, they bowed. One by one, the river lords and mountain kings dropped to one knee, baring their necks in submission to the power she commanded. What of the traitors? Darius asked, gesturing to where guards were now hauling a sobbing Isla and a shell-shocked Tristan to their feet. Lucian looked at Aria. It is your judgment to pass, my queen. They hurt you. They discarded you. Do you want their heads? Aria looked at Tristan. He was weeping, begging silently with his eyes, mouthing the word please. He looked small, pathetic. Killing him would be a mercy he didn't deserve, and it would stain her new reign with blood she didn't want to shed. No, Aria said, her voice steady and cold. Death is too quick. And too honorable. She walked to the edge of the dais, looking down at the man she had once thought was her world. Tristan Cole, you wanted a crown. You wanted power. You will have neither. She pointed to the doors. You are stripped of your rank. You are stripped of your name. You and Isla are banished to the wastes. If you step foot in the 7 packs again, the wolves will hunt you for sport. Tristan collapsed, wailing. The wastes were a frozen hellscape where rogue wolves went to starve or freeze. It was a death sentence, but a slow, agonizing one. Take them, Lucian commanded. As the guards dragged the screaming pair from the hall, Lucian turned to Aria. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the glowing lines of the mark that bound them together. I told you, he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. I offered you a throne. Aria closed her eyes, feeling the hum of the mark, the strength of the man holding her, and the power coursing through her own veins. She wasn't broken anymore. She was forged. And I accepted, she whispered back. And that is how a broken healer became the queen of 7 packs. What did you think of the ending? Should they have banished Tristan, or did he deserve worse? Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next story.